How well do you really know the ground you're lying on? Not the floor, not the foundation. I mean the rock underneath all of it. The deep, patient stone that's been sitting there since long before anyone thought to build a house on top of it. How solid do you think it is? And what would you say if I told you that in one particular corner of America, that ground is not solid at all, that it is riddled, hollowed, threaded through with thousands of passages that no human being has ever walked, lit by nothing, opening into rooms the size of cathedrals that have never once been seen? How many, do you think? 100? A few hundred? The real number is somewhere past 7,500, and that's only the ones we've found and written down. In one state. And people are still finding new ones, dozens of them, every single year. So here's the question I'd like to leave sitting in the back of your mind as you settle in. What exactly is down there? Who went down first, and why? What did they take out, and what did they leave behind? And why is it that almost every small town in the Ozarks has a story? A whispered, half-serious, grandfather told it to me story, about a tunnel that goes somewhere it shouldn't. Subscribe if you haven't already, 'cause tonight we're going to go down there together. Slowly, very slowly. We're going to spend the next couple of hours crawling through the hollow country underneath Missouri and Arkansas and a little bit of Oklahoma and Kansas. The Ozark Plateau, one of the most thoroughly perforated landscapes on the face of the earth. And I've got 100 things to tell you about it. 100 small, strange, true things laid end to end, from the deep geological past all the way up to the people who are down there right now with headlamps and survey tape, mapping the dark one measurement at a time. Some of it is science. Some of it is history. Some of it is treasure legend and outlaw myth, and the kind of story that grows in a place where the ground genuinely does swallow things. I'll tell you which is which as we go. I'm not going to sell you anything that isn't true, and where the record gets murky, and in the Ozarks it gets murky often, I'll say so plainly, and we'll sit with the uncertainty together. There's something restful about uncertainty, I think, when nothing depends on it. Now, before we start, you don't need to remember any of this. That's not what tonight is for. If you drift off around fact number 9, you will have missed 91 perfectly good facts, and it will not matter even slightly. The story will still be here. The caves have been there for 2 million years. They can wait for you. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day go out of your jaw and your hands. And let's go underground. Fact 1. And it's the one everything else rests on. The Ozarks are not mountains. I know they look like mountains. If you've ever driven US 65 south out of Springfield, or wound your way through the Boston Mountains in northern Arkansas with your ears popping, you'd swear you were in mountains. But you're not. You're on a dome. A vast, ancient, gently swollen bulge of the Earth's crust that got pushed upward, slowly, over an enormous stretch of time, and then spent the next few 100 million years being carved back down by rain. So the valleys are not places where mountains failed to form. The valleys are the subtraction. Every hollow, every bluff, every crooked river bend is a place where water removed something. What's left standing is simply what the water hasn't gotten to yet. Think about that for a second, because it changes the whole picture. You're not looking at a landscape that was built up. You're looking at a landscape that was excavated. And a landscape that gets excavated from above is a landscape that's also being excavated from within. Fact 2. The rock doing all this hosting is mostly dolomite and limestone, and it was laid down at the bottom of a warm, shallow tropical sea somewhere in the neighborhood of 450 to 500 million years ago. Geologists have names for these layers, and I love saying them out loud because they sound like the names of old railroad towns. The Gasconade, the Roubidou, the Jefferson City, the Eminence, the Potosi, stacked one on top of the next like sheets of paper, hundreds of feet thick. And here's what I want you to picture. That rock is made of the bodies of things, shells, coral fragments, the calcium skeletons of small marine animals settling into mud on a seafloor that sat, back then, near the equator. What is now a dry Missouri hillside covered in oak and hickory was once a warm lagoon. The rock under your feet in the Ozarks is a graveyard that got compressed into stone. Fact 3. There is a word for country like this, and the word is karst. It comes from a plateau on the border of Slovenia and Italy, the Kras in Slovene, a stony white landscape so full of holes and sinking streams that when 19th century geologists went looking for a name for the phenomenon, they simply borrowed the place. So every time an American geologist says Ozark karst, they are, without quite realizing it, comparing a hillside in Arkansas to a limestone plateau above the Adriatic Sea. Fact 4, and this is the beautiful one. Caves are made by weak acid. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. Rain falls. On its way down, it picks up a little carbon dioxide from the air, and then it soaks into the soil, where there's far more carbon dioxide. From roots breathing, from bacteria breaking down last autumn's leaves. Water plus carbon dioxide makes carbonic acid. It's an extremely feeble acid. It's the same thing that's in sparkling water. You could drink a glass of it right now and feel nothing but fizz. But limestone and dolomite dissolve in it, slowly, molecule by molecule. And when you give a feeble acid a few 100,000 years and an endless supply of rain, it will hollow out a hill. Sit with that a moment. Every enormous underground room in the Ozarks, the ones with ceilings 150 feet up, the ones you could park a cathedral inside, was dissolved out of solid stone by rainwater that was barely acidic enough to taste. Not blasted, not carved, dissolved, the way a sugar cube goes soft in tea, except the sugar cube is a mountain, and the tea takes 1,000,000 years. Fact 5. How slow is slow. Cave passages typically enlarge by a fraction of a millimeter per year, some far less. If you could stand in a young Ozark cave and watch it grow, you would die of old age without seeing the walls move a hair's width. The big trunk passages of the region, the ones you can walk upright in for a mile, represent, in most estimates, somewhere between hundreds of thousands and a few million years of continuous, patient work by water. That's the pace of this place. That's the tempo I want you to sink into tonight. Nothing underground is in a hurry. Nothing down there has ever been in a hurry. Fact 6. Not all cave passages are made the same way, and the difference explains why so many Ozark caves feel like hallways. When a passage forms completely underwater, below the water table, in what cavers call the phreatic zone, the water fills the whole void and dissolves in every direction at once. You get tubes, round, smooth, almost machine-looking, like something a giant worm bored out. But when the land rises, or the river cuts down, the water table drops, and now that old tube has air in it, and a stream running along the bottom of it. That stream cuts downward, like a knife into a cake. Cavers call that the vadose zone. and you get a passage shaped like a keyhole, a round tube up top, a narrow slot below. So when you walk into an Ozark cave and see that shape overhead, you are reading a history of the river outside. The cave is a record of how the valley got deeper. Fact 7. Missouri calls itself the Cave State, and it has earned it. The official count kept by the Missouri Speleological Survey passed 7,000 caves years ago, and has kept climbing. The working number is now well north of 7,500. Arkansas has documented somewhere in the range of 2,000, and these are not final numbers. They are running totals. Every year, new caves are added, often several dozen, because somebody's cow fell into a hole, or a bulldozer opened a crack, or a caver crawled into a rabbit-sized opening that nobody had bothered with and found it went 400 feet. Here's the thought I want to leave with you. There's a real, non-trivial chance that the largest cave in the Ozarks has not been discovered yet, hasn't been fully explored, hasn't been found. It is sitting there tonight in the dark, complete, with its own lake and its own formations and its own perfectly still air, waiting for a bad rainstorm to open a hole in some pasture in Douglas County. Fact 8. Almost all of them are wild. Of those thousands of Missouri caves, only around 20 are commercial show caves with lights and handrails, and a person telling jokes at the front of the tram. The rest are unlit, unimproved, and overwhelmingly on private land, under farms, under pastures, under somebody's back 40. Which means most Ozark caves belong, legally, to a farmer who may or may not know exactly what's under his hayfield. Fact 9. If a cave is a pipe, it has to drain somewhere, and in the Ozarks it drains into some of the largest springs on the planet. Big Spring, near Van Buren, Missouri, discharges an average of roughly 286 million gallons of water every day. On a big day after heavy rain, it has been measured at well over 1 billion. That water comes boiling up out of the base of a dolomite bluff, not trickling, boiling, a blue-green upwelling that turns the ground into a river within a few dozen yards. Greer Spring, on the 11 Point, is the second largest in the state and pours out around 200 million gallons a day. Mammoth Spring, just across the line in Arkansas, is comparable, roughly 9 million gallons an hour. Now think about what that means. That water didn't appear. It fell as rain, sometimes 40 or 50 miles away, sank into the ground and traveled there through passages. Real passages. Rooms and tubes and flooded corridors, most of which no human will ever see because they are completely full of water and always have been. The springs are the visible ends of an invisible plumbing system that is vastly larger than everything on the tour maps. Fact 10. There's a place in Shannon County, Missouri called Devil's Well, and I think about it more than is probably reasonable. From the surface, it is unremarkable, a hole in the ground on a wooded hillside. But go down through that hole, about 100 feet, and you come out in the ceiling of an enormous room, most of which is filled by a lake, a genuine underground lake, estimated to hold somewhere around 22 million gallons of water, 400 feet long, sitting in perfect blackness under a ridge. For years, nobody knew where its water went. So in the 1950s and 60s, researchers dumped fluorescent dye into it and waited. The dye came out at Cave Spring on the Current River more than a mile away. That underground lake is a wide spot in a river that flows entirely inside the earth. Fact 11. Sometimes the roof comes off. In Oregon County, Missouri, there's a state park called Grand Gulf, and locals have long called it the Little Grand Canyon. It's a chasm about 130 feet deep and roughly 3/4 of a mile long, with sheer walls and a natural bridge arching across it. But it isn't a canyon at all. It's a cave that collapsed. What you're standing on the edge of is the wreckage of a ceiling. The stream still runs through the bottom of it and vanishes into a passage at the far end. And dye tracing has shown that the water reappears at Mammoth Spring in Arkansas, roughly 9 miles away, taking a little over a day to make the trip. 9 miles, underground, through passages nobody has ever entered. Fact 12. Everything decorative down there, every stalactite, every stalagmite, every rippling curtain of flowstone, is just the acid running in reverse. Water dissolves limestone on the way down through the rock. Then it emerges into an air-filled cave, loses its carbon dioxide to the cave air the way a soda goes flat, and can no longer hold the dissolved stone. So it lays it back down, one microscopic ring of calcite at a time, around the rim of a drop of water hanging from the ceiling. Do that for a century, and you might get an inch. The rates vary enormously. Some formations grow much faster, some barely at all, but that old rule of thumb is close enough to be humbling, which means the modest stalactite you can reach up and touch on a cave tour started forming when Lincoln was alive. And the great columns in the big rooms, the ones as thick as oak trunks, were already ancient when the pyramids were new. Let that settle over you. Somewhere under a hillside in Missouri right now, in total darkness, a single drop of water is hanging from a ceiling, adding a layer to a stone finger, thinner than a sheet of paper, and then another drop, and another, all night while you sleep. Before we go any further, let's stay above ground for a moment, because the underworld leaves fingerprints on the surface, and once you know how to read them, you can never unsee them. If you drive through the Ozarks, you will pass sinkholes constantly and almost certainly not notice a single one. They don't look like anything dramatic. Most are shallow bowls in a pasture, a dip 40 or 100 feet across, a little greener than the ground around it, sometimes with a pond in the bottom, sometimes with a clump of trees the farmer never bothered to clear because you can't run a tractor through it comfortably. That's a cave, expressing itself at the surface. Either the roof of a void has slowly sagged, or the soil above a crack has been washing down into the rock for centuries, gradually funneling the ground into a shape like a drain. In parts of the Ozarks, there are hundreds of them per square mile. Look at aerial imagery of the Perry County sinkhole plain, and it looks like the skin of an orange. Then there are losing streams, and these are the ones that stop people in their tracks the first time. A creek runs along, perfectly ordinary, 6 feet wide and ankle deep, and then it gets smaller and smaller, and then, at some point in a gravel bed, it is simply gone, and you're standing on dry rock, and the stream bed continues downstream, bone dry, waiting for the next flood big enough to overwhelm the hole. The water didn't evaporate. It went down. It found a crack in the bed, and it left. And somewhere ahead, sometimes a mile away and sometimes 15, it comes back out. Which is why the Ozarks are full of rivers that behave impossibly. A river can lose most of its flow in a dry August and then be joined a few miles down by a spring pouring out more water than it was carrying in the first place. The Current, the Jack's Fork, the 11 Point, the Buffalo over in Arkansas, these are rivers with hidden tributaries fed as much from below as from above. And then there are the collapsed landscapes. At Hahatonka, on the Nyangwa arm of what's now Lake of the Ozarks, there's a whole complex of them. A deep chasm, a natural bridge 60 feet high and 100 feet long, a series of sinkholes, a great cliffed basin they call the Colosseum, and a spring at the bottom of it, all discharging tens of millions of gallons a day. Every one of those features is the wreckage of a cave system whose roof failed at different times and in different ways. A wealthy Kansas City businessman named Robert Snyder fell in love with that place in the early 1900s and began building a European-style stone castle on the bluff above it. He died in one of Missouri's first automobile accidents in 1906, before it was finished. His sons completed it. It was eventually run as a hotel, and in 1942, sparks from a chimney set the roof on fire and it burned to a shell in a few hours. The ruins are still standing on that bluff today, in a state park, empty windows looking out over a landscape made entirely of collapsed caves. A ruin above a ruin. And natural bridges, once you understand them, become slightly haunting objects. A natural bridge is not a bridge. It is the last surviving piece of a cave ceiling. The rest of the roof came down. That one span held. Every arch of rock you can walk under in the Ozarks is a fragment of a passage, the final remaining evidence of a tunnel that used to be there and mostly isn't. Now, here's where the story stops being purely about rock and starts being about the things that walked into it. Fact 13. On the 11th of September, 2001, a date, obviously, that nobody in America was paying attention to road construction on, a crew was blasting rock for a highway project on the northwest side of Springfield, Missouri. When the dust cleared, they had opened a hole in the side of the cut. Somebody looked in with a flashlight. What they had found is now called River Bluff Cave, and it had been sealed off from the outside world for an extraordinarily long time. Not centuries, not thousands of years. The sediment record inside stretches back, by the estimates of the researchers who've worked it, into the hundreds of thousands of years, with some claims running past 1 million. It's been described as the oldest known Ice Age fossil cave in North America, and while I'd encourage you to hold the superlatives loosely, because dating cave sediments is genuinely difficult work, and the arguments are ongoing, the contents are not in dispute. Fact 14. And here is what's inside. On the walls, several feet off the floor, there are claw marks. Long, parallel grooves gouged into the mud-coated rock by an animal standing on its hind legs and reaching up. They belong almost certainly to the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus. And I want you to understand the scale of this animal, because it's hard to hold in your head. Standing upright, a large one may have reached 10 or 11 feet. Its legs were long, and its snout was short, which is where the name comes from, and it looked less like a modern bear and more like a bear that had been stretched. It has been gone from this continent for something like 11 or 12,000 years. It stood in that room. It reached up and dragged its claws down a wall, the way a house cat does on a couch arm, for reasons we can only guess, marking territory, sharpening, or something we don't have a word for. And then the entrance closed, and the marks stayed exactly as it left them, in perfect darkness, for a length of time that makes human history look like an afternoon. Nobody saw them again until a road crew set off a charge on a Tuesday morning. Fact 15. The floor of that cave holds the tracks and wallows of peccaries, long-nosed peccaries, extinct relatives of the pigs, pressed into soft mud that then hardened and stayed. Footprints, actual footprints, of an animal that no living thing has ever seen. The cave is not open to the public and almost certainly never will be. Everything about a human body, our breath, our warmth, the lint that falls off our clothes, the skin cells we shed constantly, is a contaminant in a place like that. So it sits under Springfield, gated and monitored, being studied a few careful hours at a time. Fact 16. Guano, bat droppings, piles up on cave floors in layers, and in undisturbed caves, those layers can be meters deep and remarkably orderly, which makes them archives. Trapped in that material year by year is pollen from whatever was blooming outside, along with insect parts, seeds, and charcoal from surface fires. Core it carefully, and you can read the vegetation history of the hillside above, when the oaks came in, when the prairie retreated, when the climate turned. It's an odd thought to fall asleep to, but it's true. Some of the best records of ancient Ozark forests are written in the accumulated droppings of bats. Fact 17. Not every hole in an Ozark bluff is a cave in the technical sense. Many are rock shelters, wide, shallow overhangs, sometimes 50 or 100 feet across but only 20 or 30 feet deep, scooped out where a softer layer of rock weathered back beneath a hard one. And these mattered enormously to human beings. A rock shelter is a roof that requires no maintenance. It is dry. It faces a view. It has a floor. And it has been there since before your grandmother's people arrived. In the Ozarks, people used them for thousands of years. Fact 18, and this one is genuinely rare in world archaeology. Some of those Arkansas bluff shelters are so dry, so thoroughly protected from rain and groundwater, that organic material survived in them. Not just stone, tools, and bone, textiles, woven bags, sandals made of twisted plant fiber, cane baskets, wooden implements, cordage, feathers, gourds, corn cobs, the kinds of things that rot to nothing in almost every other site on the continent within a few generations. In most of eastern North America, archaeologists reconstruct ancient daily life from the small, hard fragments that survive. In the Ozark bluff shelters, in a handful of cases, they got the actual bag. Fact 19. In 1922 and 23, an archaeologist named Mark Raymond Harrington came through northwestern Arkansas, working for the Museum of the American Indian in New York. He excavated a series of these shelters, and he later published his findings under the title, The Ozark Bluff Dwellers. That label stuck, for better and for worse. It made it sound like a distinct tribe of cave people, which is not what it was. It was many different peoples across many different centuries who happened to share a very sensible preference for sleeping under an overhang. Fact 20. Then, the 1930s, a man named Samuel Dellinger at the University of Arkansas realized something alarming. The shelters were being emptied. Relic hunters were digging them out and selling what they found, and material that had survived 1,000 years of weather was disappearing into private hands in a single season. So Dellinger organized crews and went out to salvage what he could. He filled the university museum with crates, and here's the part I find quietly moving. A great deal of that material sat in storage for decades, understudied, because the tools to analyze it properly didn't exist yet. Researchers have gone back to those old crates again and again over the years with new techniques and found answers to questions Dellinger couldn't even have phrased. He didn't rescue those objects for his generation. He rescued them for people he would never meet. Fact 21. And what came out of that work is, in my opinion, one of the most underappreciated facts in American history. Eastern North America, including the Ozarks, is one of a small handful of places on Earth where people independently domesticated plants, not borrowed from somewhere else, independently, working with local wild species over generations, selecting the bigger seeds, the thinner hulls, the plants that held onto their seed heads instead of scattering them. The crops were not corn. Corn came much later from Mexico. These were goosefoot or chenopod, a relative of quinoa, marsh elder or sumpweed, erect knotweed, little barley, squash and bottle gourds, sunflowers. Archaeologists call it the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and much of what we know about it comes from seeds preserved in dry shelters like these. So, somewhere on a bluff in Arkansas, 4,000 years ago, someone was doing plant breeding, under an overhang, in the shade, with a dog and a fire and a view down a valley. Fact 22. The name itself comes from a shortcut. When French traders worked the rivers of the Middle Continent in the 17 and 1800s, they referred to the country upriver of the Arkansas Post as being Oaks, Arkansas, toward the Arkansas. On documents and in speech that got clipped, the way names always get clipped by the people who use them daily, down to something like Ozarks. Say that out loud a few times, let an English-speaking tongue get hold of it, and you get Ozark. The whole region is named after an abbreviation, a place name that started life as somebody's shorthand for not writing the long version. Fact 23. This was Osage country. The Osage, the Neoconska, the people of the Middle Waters, hunted and lived across an enormous territory that included most of the Ozarks, and they were, by the accounts of nearly every European who met them, physically imposing and politically formidable. They ceded their claims to this country in a series of treaties beginning in 1808, and were pushed west, and then west again, and finally to a reservation in Oklahoma that turned out, in one of history's stranger ironies, to be sitting on top of oil. There's a common claim you'll hear on cave tours that native peoples feared caves or considered them the homes of spirits. Treat it gently. It's the sort of thing that gets repeated because it's atmospheric. What's better attested is simpler and less dramatic. People across the Ozarks used cave entrances and shelters for shelter, for burial in some cases, for water, and occasionally for mining chert and minerals, not haunted. Used. Fact 24. In 1869, a mining man named Henry T. Blow, a lead man from St. Louis, later a congressman, went into a great sinkhole in the hills above, what would become Branson, Missouri. He was hoping for something valuable. He looked at the white stone glinting in the lantern light and concluded it was marble, and the place was named Marble Cave. It was not marble, it was limestone. Marble is limestone that's been cooked and squeezed by heat and pressure, and nothing of the sort had ever happened in this quiet corner of the world. So the very first commercial verdict on the most famous cave in the Ozarks was a mineralogical mistake, and the name it produced hung around for decades before drifting into the version people use now. Marble Cave. Fact 25. What Marble Cave did contain, in enormous quantity, was bat guano, and in the late 1800s that was a genuinely valuable commodity, because it makes excellent fertilizer and it can be processed for saltpeter. So, a mining operation set up. A little town grew at the mouth of the sinkhole called Marmaros, from the Greek word for marble, keeping the original error alive in a second language. Men went down into the dark on ropes and ladders, filled sacks, and hauled them back up. Reportedly, thousands of tons came out of that hole over the years before the market turned and the operation folded, and Marmaros emptied out, as mining towns do. Fact 26. In 1889, a Canadian named William Henry Lynch bought the cave, and Lynch had a different idea about what it was worth. He didn't want the guano. He wanted to show people the hole. He built stairways. He strung lights, eventually. And in the 1890s, he began charging admission to walk down into the earth, which made his cave one of the earliest commercial show caves in the region. When he died, his two daughters, Miriam and Genevieve, took it over and ran it for roughly half a century. Two unmarried sisters running a cave, guiding visitors down 500 stairs and back up again, decade after decade, into the 1940s and beyond. Fact 27. The room at the bottom is called the Cathedral Room, and the numbers on it are the kind that sound exaggerated until you're standing in it. Roughly 200 feet high. Big enough that people describe it in stories of a building, 20 of them. It is routinely called the largest cave entrance room in America. And, while superlatives like that always deserve a raised eyebrow, nobody disputes that it is genuinely, stomach-turningly vast. And that ceiling, the great dome of it, is not the original ceiling. It's a collapse scar. At some point in some year nobody recorded, the roof of that chamber failed and came down, and the rubble of it is what you walk on. The room you enter is the room the collapse made. Fact 28. Here's what happens next, and it's the part almost nobody knows. In 1946, a family named Herschend, Hugo and Mary from Illinois, took a long lease on the cave, 99 years. They ran cave tours, and then, in 1960, they built a small mock 1870s mining village up on the surface, next to the cave entrance, mostly to give visitors something to do while they waited their turn to go down. 5 shops, a little log square. That waiting area is Silver Dollar City. One of the most successful theme parks in the United States grew out of a queue. The whole enterprise, the rides, the crowds, the roller coasters that thread through those hills, exists because of a hole in the ground that a man in 1869 mistook for marble. Fact 29. Now, let's talk about treasure, because you cannot spend 2 hours underneath the Ozarks and not talk about treasure. Near Sulphur Springs, Arkansas, there's a cave known as the Old Spanish Treasure Cave. The story attached to it. And I want to be careful here, because this is legend and not history, holds that a party of Spanish conquistadors came north, gathered gold, were pursued or trapped, and sealed their haul inside a cave in the hills. The remarkable thing is not the story. The remarkable thing is what people did about it. Treasure hunters have dug in that cave, not once, repeatedly over more than a century. There are passages in there that exist because men went at solid rock with picks on the strength of a rumor. Nothing has ever been recovered. No gold, no Spanish artifacts, no verified conquistador presence anywhere near the site. What there is, at the end of all that digging, is a longer cave than there used to be. Fact 30. Then there are the Yoakum silver dollars, which is the treasure legend I like best because it comes with physical objects. The story, in its usual form, runs like this. In the early 1800s, the Yoakum family, brothers, settled along the White River and the James Fork in what's now the Branson area, came into a source of silver. Where they got it depends on who's telling it. A mine shown to them by the Delaware people who lived nearby, or a lost Spanish working, or something else. And rather than trade the raw metal, they minted it. Coins, roughly the weight of a U.S. dollar, stamped with something like Yoakum dollar. And here's the hook. Those coins were reportedly used, spent at the trading post, accepted at the federal land office in Springfield when settlers came to pay for their homesteads, which, if true, would mean the United States government took private Ozark currency in exchange for public land. Then Indian removal came, the family scattered, and the source of the silver was lost. People have hunted that mine for 2 centuries. Nobody has produced the mine, and no coin has been authenticated to the satisfaction of numismatists, though claims surface periodically. It is folklore, but it's the kind of folklore with just enough documentary smoke around the edges that serious local historians can't quite dismiss it. And that's exactly the temperature at which a legend survives longest. Fact 31. Which brings us, inevitably, to Jesse James. Merrimack Caverns, near Stanton, Missouri, is probably the most famous cave in the state, and it is famous largely because of one man, Lester B. Dill. Dill took it over in the 1930s and turned it into an attraction with a genius for promotion that would be remarkable in any era. The story he told, and told relentlessly, was that Jesse James and his gang used the cave as a hideout, that they escaped a posse through it, that this hole in the Merrimack Valley was an outlaw stronghold. Is it true? Almost certainly not in the form it's told. Historians who work on the James gang find no good contemporary evidence for it. What's documented is that Dill was an extraordinary showman who understood that a cave with a story sells more tickets than a cave with only geology. He even, in the 1940s and 50s, exhibited a very old man who claimed to be Jesse James, living under an assumed name, a claim that has been thoroughly rejected, but which drew crowds for years. Fact 32. And Dill's promotional machine had a side effect you have absolutely encountered. He paid farmers across the Midwest to let him paint their barn roofs with advertisements for the caverns. Hundreds of barns, an outdoor advertising empire visible from the new highways. And he is widely credited with popularizing something even more pervasive, the bumper sticker. He had his crews attach printed cardboard signs to visitors' cars in the parking lot while they were underground, so every car leaving Stanton became a rolling advertisement for the next few hundred miles. So the next time you're behind a car covered in stickers from national parks and roadside attractions, there's a decent case that the whole tradition traces back to a caveman in Missouri who wanted more people to come look at his rocks. Fact 33. But strip the outlaw myth away and there's a real Civil War story underneath, and it's about gunpowder. Gunpowder needs saltpeter, potassium nitrate. And in the 1800s, the most reliable American source of saltpeter was cave dirt. Bat guano and cave sediment over long periods become rich in nitrates. So you dig the dirt out, put it in wooden vats, run water through it to leach out the nitrates, boil the liquid down, and crystallize the salt. Caves all over the Ozarks and the greater Appalachian and Mississippi karst were mined this way, some heavily during the War of 1812 and again during the Civil War. In some caves you can still see the leaching vats, or the marks of them, or the tool scars in the sediment where men worked by candlelight. That is a genuinely strange chain of causation to lie in bed thinking about. Bats hunted moths over an Ozark hollow. Their droppings accumulated for centuries in the dark. Men dug it up, boiled it, and made it into powder. And the powder went into a cartridge, and the cartridge went into a rifle, and the rifle changed a life somewhere on a battlefield in Tennessee. Fact 34. Missouri's Civil War was not primarily a war of great battles. It was a guerrilla war, the ugliest kind, fought between bushwhackers and jayhawkers and militia across a landscape of hollows and ridges where families on the same creek were on opposite sides and knew it. And that kind of war makes a cave extremely valuable. A cave is a place to hide men, hide horses, hide grain, hide yourself when the riders come through. Local traditions all across the Ozarks hold that this cave sheltered deserters, or that one hid a family's livestock, or that a particular bluff overhang was where the women and children went when word came that men were on the road. Most of those stories can't be verified, but unlike the treasure legends, they're inherently plausible. If you lived on a hollow with a cave in it in 1863, you would absolutely have used the cave. Fact 35. After the war, in the 1880s, the hills around Taney and Christian counties produced a vigilante movement called the Bald Knobbers, named for the treeless hilltops, the Balds, where they first met. They started as a law and order committee in a county where the courts had essentially stopped functioning. They ended as masked night riders in horned hoods, and the violence eventually got bad enough that the state had to break them. You'll sometimes hear that they met in caves. It's plausible in individual cases and unproven in general. The Balds are right there in the name, but the association stuck, and it feeds the same instinct we keep circling. When something secret happens in the Ozarks, people assume it happened underground. Fact 36. And I think that instinct is worth naming directly, because it's the psychological engine behind half the stories in this episode. In a landscape where the ground demonstrably does have holes in it, where a sinkhole really can open in a pasture overnight, where a stream really does vanish into a hillside and come out 9 miles away. The idea that there are more tunnels than anyone has admitted stops feeling like superstition. It starts feeling like a reasonable inference. The Ozarks are a place where the paranoid instinct and the geological reality happen to agree. Let's pause here for a moment and do something a little different. Let me walk you into a wild cave, not a show cave. No lights, no handrails, because I want you to feel the shape of it before we go back to the history. You park at the edge of a field. There's a fence and a hillside, and at the base of the hillside a dark slot under an overhang, maybe 4 feet high, with a small stream running out of it. It's 92 degrees and humid, and the cicadas are unbearable. And out of that slot comes a steady exhalation of cold air, and you can feel it on your shins from 10 feet away. You duck in, and the first thing that happens is that the noise stops. Not gradually. Within about 15 feet, the cicadas are gone, the wind is gone, the road noise is gone, and you are in a stone room with a stream in it, and the loudest thing in the world is water on gravel. Biologists call that first stretch the entrance zone. Light still reaches it. Green things grow there, moss, ferns, algae on wet rock, and it's full of ordinary animals taking advantage of the cool. Spiders, frogs, phoebes nesting on the ledges, sometimes a snake near the mouth waiting for something to blunder out. Go a little further and you reach the twilight zone. This is my favorite part of any cave. There's still light, but it's directional and blue and failing, and everything is silhouette. Plants can't survive here, but they're still trying. You'll find pale, drawn-out seedlings that germinated from a seed washed in on a flood, growing toward a light that isn't strong enough, dying slowly. Cave crickets sit on the walls here with their legs spread wide. Then you turn a corner, and the light is gone, and you are in the dark zone, permanent dark. And this is where the cave becomes a different kind of place, a place with stable temperature, near total humidity, and no day, no night either, no seasons, or barely any. It's the only environment on the planet's surface where those variables simply drop out of the equation, and your body notices. People often report a very specific feeling in the first hour underground, something between calm and unease, the nervous system realizing that a whole category of input has been switched off. The physical reality of caving, meanwhile, is deeply unglamorous. It is mud. Mud on everything of a particular gray-brown consistency, in your boots and your sleeves and your hair. It is stooping for 400 feet, with your neck at an angle that will hurt tomorrow. It is a crawl where you go flat and push your helmet ahead of you with your chin, because there isn't room to lift your head. It is cold water at chest height for 30 yards, and the moment where you have to decide whether the passage beyond is worth being that cold. And then it opens. That's the thing that keeps people going back. You come out of a crawl into a room where your light doesn't reach the ceiling, and you stand up for the first time in 20 minutes, and you swing the beam around and it just goes out into nothing, and there is a formation the size of a car that has been standing there in absolute darkness for longer than the human species has had agriculture. Nobody photographs that well. Cave photography is famously hard, because the eye adapts and the camera doesn't, and every published cave picture is a lie of sorts. A room lit by 6 flashes that no one standing there ever saw all at once, which is a strange, lovely thing to sit with. The rooms, as they truly are, unlit, are unphotographable and unseeable. What you experience in a cave is always a small moving circle of light and an unknown quantity of blackness around it, and you assemble the room in your head from the pieces. Now, let's go back up to the surface and spend some time with the caves people actually opened up and put lights in, because the human stories attached to them are stranger than the ones invented for the brochures. Fact 37. Fantastic Caverns, just northwest of Springfield, Missouri, was found in 1862 by a dog. The story, which is well established locally, is that a farmer named John Knox owned the land, and his dog went into a hole in a hillside and didn't come back out the way it went in. Knox followed, and then, because there was a war on and a hole in the ground was the least of anyone's problems, he mostly kept quiet about it for years. Fact 38. In 1867, he placed an advertisement in a Springfield newspaper looking for explorers. 12 people answered it. All 12 were women, members of a local women's athletic club. Picture that, in 1867. 12 women in the clothing of 1867, with candles and lanterns, climbing down into an unmapped cave in the Missouri countryside because somebody put an ad in the paper. They explored it, and they signed their names on the cave wall. Those signatures are still there. They're a stop on the modern tour. 12 names, written in smoke or in mineral pigment on a limestone wall in the year Andrew Johnson was being impeached, still legible in a room that has not changed since. Fact 39. The same cave has had a remarkably checkered career since. In the 1920s, during the Second Klan's ugly national resurgence, it was reportedly used for Klan meetings, a private, invisible, echoing room being exactly what a secret society wants. And then, in the 1950s and 60s, it became a country music venue. A stage was built underground. Bands played. People came out from Springfield on Saturday nights to sit in a cave and listen to music, in a room that had 30 years earlier hosted hooded men. Sit with that for a second. The sheer indifference of a room. The stone doesn't care. It hosted an extinct bear, then 12 adventurous women, then a hate group, then a house band. It's just a space. We're the ones who keep changing. Fact 40. Today, Fantastic Caverns is the only cave in America you tour entirely by riding. Jeep-drawn trams that carry you through on the bed of an ancient underground riverbed. And that isn't a gimmick, or not only a gimmick. It's a conservation decision. Foot traffic compacts cave floors, tracks in lint and mud, and destroys the delicate crusts and microformations at ankle level. Keeping everyone in a vehicle on one narrow track leaves the rest of the floor alone. Fact 41. Onondaga Cave on the Merrimack River in Crawford County was found in the 1880s and became famous early. It was promoted to visitors during the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, when people came out from the city by train and rowed boats into it by lantern light. And then it became the site of what may be the pettiest and most entertaining property dispute in the history of American tourism. Fact 42. The cave ran under land belonging to more than one owner. So the owners divided it, underground. They ran a fence, a wire fence, inside the cave through the passage, and each side operated its own commercial tour on its own half, which meant that two groups of paying tourists, led by two rival guides, would arrive at the fence at the same time from opposite directions. And the guides, by every account that survives, would insult each other and each other's caves through the wire, while the customers stood there holding their lanterns. I want you to hold that image as you drift off. Underground, a fence, two tour guides shouting at each other about whose stalactites were better. Fact 43. That cave nearly drowned. In the 1960s and 70s, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed the Merrimack Park Dam, which would have created a large reservoir on the Merrimack River, and the pool would have flooded Onondaga. What followed was a genuine grassroots fight. Lester Dill, the Merrimack Caverns showman, who by then also owned Onondaga, turned his promotional gifts toward the dam, and a coalition of cavers, landowners, canoeists, and conservationists took it on. The Nature Conservancy stepped in to help protect the cave itself. And in 1978, in an advisory referendum across the affected counties, voters rejected the dam decisively. Congress eventually deauthorized it. Onondaga became a Missouri state park. It is, as far as these things go, a happy ending. A cave saved by a vote. Fact 44. Cross into Arkansas now, into the Ozark National Forest in Stone County. In 1955, two local men, Hugh Shell and Hale Bryant, descended into a pit near Blanchard Springs and found their way into an enormous, spectacularly decorated system that nobody had entered before. What happened next is unusual. The cave was on national forest land, So the U.S. Forest Service developed it, and they took their time about it. Nearly 2 decades of survey, planning, and construction went into building an access tunnel, elevators, and trails designed from the outset to minimize damage. Blanchard Springs Caverns opened to the public in 1973, and it remains one of the very few major show caves in the country developed and operated by the federal government. Fact 45. There's a phrase you'll hear at Blanchard and a few other places: a living cave. It means the water is still running, the formations are still growing, the system is still doing what it does. Many older show caves were, frankly, dried out or damaged by the way they were developed a century ago. Passages blasted, streams diverted, formations broken off and sold. A living cave is one where the process didn't stop when the lights went in. Fact 46. Near Berryville, Arkansas, there's Cosmic Cavern, known since the 1840s, which contains still glass-clear pools that locals called bottomless for generations, because no one could find the floor with a weighted line. Divers eventually did find bottoms, as divers do, but the pools are genuinely deep, genuinely silent, and hold trout that live out their lives in water that has never once seen the sun. Fact 47. In Springfield, there's a small cave in a city park called Sequiota, and in the 1920s, it was a resort. You could take a boat ride into it, on a little underground stream, as a day out. Today, the entrance is gated with a heavy steel grill, not to keep people from having fun, to let bats in and keep humans out, because the cave turned out to be an important roost, and the two uses are not compatible. There's a whole quiet history of the 20th century in that one gate, a place that went from amusement to habitat, from something we used to something we protect. Fact 48. And this is a good moment to say the awkward part out loud. Nearly every show cave you can visit in the Ozarks was damaged in the process of becoming visitable. Passages were widened with dynamite. Floors were poured with concrete. Streams were dammed for boat rides. Formations were broken off and sold as souvenirs by the crate. The modern industry knows this, and much of it has genuinely reformed. The good operators now run their caves with real care and fund real research. But when you walk through a lit passage, you're walking through a compromise. The reason you get to see it at all is that somebody once treated it as a business, and the reason parts of it are gone is exactly the same. Fact 49. Lights create their own problem, and it has a name: Lampan flora, green algae, moss, and ferns growing on the rock around every fixed light in a show cave, because you have introduced the one thing the cave has never had, a permanent source of energy, into an ecosystem built entirely around its absence. Cave managers scrub it off with dilute bleach or peroxide. It grows back. Every lit cave in the world is quietly fighting a slow green tide that exists only because we want it to look. Fact 50. Which is why the best moment on any cave tour is the one where the guide turns everything off. Total darkness. Not dim, not shadowy, the complete absence of photons, which almost no person on Earth experiences in ordinary life. Your pupils open as far as they can, and it makes no difference at all. Your eyes, receiving nothing, will eventually start manufacturing faint, drifting shapes and colors, the visual system generating noise because it has no signal. And people report seeing swirls, sparks, dull glows that aren't there. And the second thing you notice is the silence, which is not silence. There's water somewhere. A drip. Then another drip, from a different direction, at a different pitch. on a slightly different rhythm. And with your eyes useless, that becomes the whole world. That sound has been going on in those rooms, unheard, since before there were people to hear it. It's going on right now. Now, let's talk about what lives down there, because the answer is a great deal more than you'd expect, and almost all of it is strange. Fact 51. Biologists sort cave creatures into 3 groups, and the vocabulary is worth having. Troglodytes are cave guests. They use caves but can't complete their lives inside. Bats, most famously, and bears and pack rats, and, historically, us. Troglophiles are cave lovers, able to live their whole lives underground but also able to get by outside. Certain salamanders, some crickets, various beetles. And troglobites are the true prisoners. Obligate cave species. They cannot survive outside. Their entire evolutionary lineage has committed to the dark. Fact 52. And you can spot a troglobite instantly because they all converge on the same look regardless of what family they come from. They lose their pigment, going white or translucent, pale enough in some species that you can see the gut through the body wall. They lose their eyes, sometimes down to nothing but a smudge of tissue under the skin. And they grow long. Long legs, long antennae, long sensory hairs, because when you can't see, the only way to know the world is to touch more of it at once. Blind, white, and covered in feelers. That's what evolution produces over and over in isolated dark places on every continent, in animals utterly unrelated to each other. Which tells you something profound. Darkness is a design constraint, and it has a solution, and life keeps finding the same one. Fact 53. The Ozark cavefish, Amblyopsis rosae, lives in cave streams across a small patch of southwest Missouri, northwest Arkansas, and northeast Oklahoma, and almost nowhere else on Earth. It is about 2 inches long, pinkish white, and nearly translucent. It has no functional eyes. Instead, its head and body are covered with rows of tiny sensory papillae that detect the faintest movement in the water. So it hunts by feeling the pressure wave of something small, moving nearby in total blackness. Fact 54. And it lives on the slowest possible budget. Food is scarce underground. Nothing grows there. So the cavefish has an extremely low metabolic rate, grows slowly, breeds rarely, and produces very few eggs. Individuals are thought to live well over a decade, possibly much longer. Think about what that means for its situation. An animal that reproduces slowly, in tiny numbers, in a handful of specific caves, in an aquifer that people drink from and drain into. It's federally listed as threatened, and the reason is not that anything hunts it. It's that its entire world is a plumbing system that we also happen to use. Fact 55. The grotto salamander is the one I'd tell you about if I could only tell you one. It begins life as a larva in a cave stream, and as a larva, it has eyes. Functional, normal, working eyes, plus external gills and a healthy dose of dark pigment, and it swims around like any other young salamander. Then it metamorphoses, and during that transformation, it loses its pigment, going pale pinkish white, and its eyelids fuse shut. The eye degenerates behind them and sinks into the head. It is not born blind. It becomes blind on schedule as a normal part of growing up. It has an evolutionary memory of light, expressed once in youth and then closed over. The only cave-adapted salamander in North America that does this. Fact 56. In Taney County, Missouri, there is a cave on private land called Tumbling Creek Cave, and it is home to a snail found nowhere else in the world, the tumbling creek cave snail, Antrobia culveri. It is roughly the size of a pinhead, white, blind, living on rocks in a cave stream, grazing on films of bacteria. In the 1970s, surveys counted them in the many hundreds. By the early 2000s, repeated counts were finding fewer than 50. It became one of the most endangered animals in North America, and the likely causes were all coming from the surface. Sediment washing in from disturbed land, bacteria from livestock and septic systems, changes in the water in a recharge area that stretches for miles. Fact 57. That cave has been watched over since 1966 by a hydrogeologist named Tom Oley, who bought the land above it and founded what he called the Ozark Underground Laboratory, precisely so somebody could study the thing carefully and protect it at the same time. He and his family have spent a lifetime on it. I find that quietly heroic in a way that has nothing to do with drama. A man arranged his entire life around a cave and a snail almost too small to see. There's no monument, no crowd, just decades of measurements in a hollow in Missouri. Fact 58. Now the bats and the Ozarks matter enormously to bats. The gray bat, Myotis crescens, is a cave obligate. It roosts in caves year-round, which is unusual, and it's extraordinarily concentrated. The overwhelming majority of the entire species, the figure usually cited is around 95%, hibernates in fewer than a dozen or so caves, not a dozen counties, a dozen caves, and several of the most important are in the Ozarks. Sit with the fragility of that. One species, a handful of rooms. If something happens in those rooms, it happens to all of them at once. Fact 59. A summer maternity colony can number in the hundreds of thousands of animals in a single cave. The mothers give birth to one pup a year. One. And leave them clustered on the ceiling in a dense mass while they hunt. And when a mother returns at dawn to a ceiling holding 250,000 squirming, identical screaming babies, she finds her own. Every time. By voice and by smell, in the dark, in that noise. Fact 60. What they're doing out there all night is eating insects, and the volume is hard to hold in your head. A single small bat can consume thousands of insects in one night's foraging, a substantial fraction of its own body weight. Multiply by a colony of 200,000. Multiply by every night of a summer. The tonnage is enormous, and a lot of it comes off farmland. There's a real, calculable agricultural value to what those animals do for free, every night, above the fields, while everybody sleeps. The bats hanging in a Missouri cave are part of the reason the corn works. Fact 61. And then, in 2006, in a cave in New York State, someone photographed hibernating bats with white fuzz on their muzzles. It's a cold-loving fungus, Pseudogymnoascus destructans, almost certainly introduced from Europe, where bats have long since evolved to tolerate it. American bats had not. The fungus grows on them while they hibernate, irritating the skin and wings, and rouses them repeatedly during the winter. And every rousing burns fat they cannot replace, because there are no insects in January. They starve to death in their sleep months before spring. They call it white nose syndrome. It reached Missouri around 2010 and spread through the Ozarks in the years after. In some caves, in some species, mortality has exceeded 90%. Rooms that held tens of thousands of northern long-eared bats have been reduced to handfuls. Fact 62. That's why so many caves are closed now. and why you'll be asked at the entrance of the ones that aren't whether you've been in another cave and asked to walk through a disinfectant mat. Spores travel on boots and clothing and gear. The single most useful thing a human being can do for bats is to be careful about what they carry from one hole in the ground to another. Fact 63. Here's the thing about a cave ecosystem that took biologists a long time to fully appreciate. There is no bottom to the food chain. There's no photosynthesis. Nothing down there makes food from light, so every calorie in the system was imported. It came in on the flood, as leaves and twigs and drowned worms washed through the entrance. It came in on a cricket that went out at night to feed and came back. And above all, it came in as guano, bat droppings, raining down on the floor, forming the base of a whole community of beetles and mites and fungi and the things that eat them. A cave is an ecosystem that runs entirely on remittances. Everything it has was earned somewhere else and sent home in the dark. Fact 64. And there's one more resident worth mentioning. The cave cricket, with those absurd long antennae, standing on a wall near the entrance with its legs splayed. Watch one for a while, and you'll see it doesn't move much. It can't afford to. Everything down there is running a low-energy strategy. Move less, eat less, live longer, wait. That's the general rule of the underworld, and honestly, it's not bad advice for a person trying to fall asleep. Slow everything down. Spend less. Wait. And before we leave the living things, there are two more residents I can't skip, because they're the ones that surprise people. The first is the pack rat, the eastern wood rat in most of the Ozarks, and it is one of the accidental heroes of North American science. Wood rats build nests, and they are compulsive collectors. They bring in sticks and seeds and bones and cactus spines and, given the chance, shiny objects, coins, spoons, the caps off water bottles. And they build these piles in dry, sheltered places, the backs of rock shelters, cave entrances, ledges. Then they urinate on them, constantly, over generations. And wood rat urine, as it dries in a dry cave, crystallizes into a hard, dark, resinous substance that encases the whole nest and preserves it. Scientists call these middens, and in dry country they can survive for tens of thousands of years, sealed, dated, and packed with the actual plant material that was growing within a short walk of that nest in a specific century. There are places in North America where our best record of ancient vegetation comes from cemented piles of garbage assembled by rats. In the wetter Ozarks, they don't last quite so spectacularly, but the principle holds, and cavers who find an old midden in a dry back passage know they may be looking at somebody's laboriously assembled 1,000-year-old junk drawer. The second thing is smell, which nobody mentions and everybody notices. Caves smell. Not badly, mostly. It's a specific, clean, mineral, faintly earthy smell that people who spend time underground can identify instantly and find very difficult to describe. Wet stone, damp clay, a hint of something almost sweet. It's largely the smell of moist rock and the bacteria and fungi living on it. And once you've spent a day in a cave, you'll recognize it in a basement or a subway or a root cellar for the rest of your life. Caves with big bat colonies smell different, sharply ammoniac, and in some cases genuinely dangerous, because a huge guano deposit generates ammonia and supports fungi whose spores can make people quite ill. That's a real hazard and part of why big bat caves aren't casual destinations. And some caves smell of nothing at all, because the air in them has been sitting perfectly still for a very long time. cavers talk about breaking into a sealed room and noticing, before anything else, an absolute stillness in the air. No draft, no movement, the dust of a century lying undisturbed on the flowstone because nothing has ever come through to stir it. That's about as close as a person can get to standing in a room that has genuinely never been used. Fact 65. Let's talk about how anyone knows where underground water goes, because it's one of my favorite pieces of practical science, and it's beautifully simple. You dye it. A researcher pours a measured quantity of a fluorescent tracer, fluorescin, which glows a startling green, or one of several others, into a sinking stream or a sinkhole. Then, at every spring for miles around, they hang small packets of activated charcoal in the water. The charcoal absorbs the dye out of the flow, concentrating it, so that even absurdly dilute traces can be detected later in a lab. Come back in a few days, collect the packets, analyze them, and now you know the water that vanished into that hillside came out there. Fact 66. Tom Ailey, the man with the snail, did a great deal of this work in the Ozarks, and the results reshaped how people understood the region. Water travels underground here, for miles, sometimes many miles, and it travels fast, not seeping through rock at inches per day, but running through open conduits at the speed of a stream. The recharge area for a single big Ozark spring can cover hundreds of square miles and cross county lines. It does not respect property boundaries, watershed maps drawn from surface topography, or anybody's assumptions. Fact 67. And that has a hard consequence. If you spill something into a sinkhole in karst country, fuel, manure, pesticide, anything, it does not get filtered. There's no slow percolation through sand and soil to clean it up. It goes into a pipe and it comes out at a spring, largely intact, sometimes within a day or two, sometimes miles from where you put it, which is why the old rural habit of using a sinkhole as a dump, a place to roll dead livestock, junk cars, barrels, was so quietly catastrophic. People assumed a hole in the ground was an ending. It's not an ending, it's an entrance. Fact 68. Hundreds of thousands of people across the Ozarks drink water that has been inside a cave. That's not a metaphor. The Ozark aquifer supplies wells and springs across the region, and in karst that water may have been an open underground stream a day earlier. You can lie in a motel in Mountain View or West Plains, turn on the tap, and drink something that was, very recently, flowing past a blind salamander in absolute darkness. Fact 69. Caves hold their temperature with remarkable steadiness, and the number is close to the average annual temperature at the surface above them. In most of the Ozarks, that lands somewhere around 56 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Call it 13 or 14 Celsius. All day, all night, every month of the year. That's why a cave entrance breathes cold in July and steams warm in January. The cave isn't changing. You are. Fact 70. And that constant temperature is exactly why human beings have spent 2 centuries figuring out things to do with holes in the ground. Which brings us to the second half of tonight's story, and to tunnels that nobody dissolved. Tunnels that people dug. Because the Ozarks are not only full of caves, they are full of mines. Fact 71. Start in the old lead belt in St. Francois County, Missouri, east of the Ozark Uplift's ancient core. French colonists were mining lead here in the 1700s, and by the late 1800s, the St. Joseph Lead Company was operating on an industrial scale. Beneath the town of Bonne Terre, they hollowed out something extraordinary. A mine on multiple levels, with, by common accounts, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 miles of tunnel. Not a shaft, a city. Rooms with ceilings held up by pillars of unmined rock, hauling ways, rail lines, shops, and underground barns for the mules. Fact 72. It closed in 1962. The pumps that had held the water back for decades were shut off, and the water, which had been trying to reclaim that space the entire time, came in. The lower levels flooded. What had been the bottom of a working mine became a lake. Not a small one. The water filling those workings is measured in the billions of gallons, and it is startlingly clear, because there's nothing in it. No algae, no plankton, no runoff, no light. Fact 73. Which is why Bonneterre Mine is now, of all things, a dive resort. Commonly described as the largest freshwater dive location in the world. Divers descend into an industrial landscape that was abandoned in the middle of a working day and then filled with water. Ore carts sit where they were left. Tools lie on ledges. Rails run down into the clear water and disappear. The old mule barns are down there, scaffolding, ladders, staircases going down into blue-black nothing. Visibility in that water is often 100 feet or more. So a diver hanging in the middle of a flooded room can see the whole room at once. Something no miner ever could, working by carbide lamp. Jacques Cousteau's team reportedly filmed there in the early 1980s, which tells you something about how unusual it is. Fact 74. And there is a detail about that mine that I can't shake. The mules. Mules were lowered into deep mines and, in many operations around the world, spent their entire working lives underground, stabled below and never brought up. The old miner's story, repeated at Bonneterre and at mines across the world, is that they went blind. Historians and veterinarians are more cautious about that, and practices varied enormously from mine to mine, so hold it loosely. But the underlying picture is documented enough to be sobering. Animals working their whole lives in lamplight, in stone corridors, breathing dust for people they could barely see. Fact 75. Missouri did not stop mining lead. The viburnum trend, sometimes called the New Lead Belt, was discovered in the 1950s, running through Iron, Reynolds, and Washington counties, and it turned out to be one of the richest lead deposits on Earth. Those mines go down over 1,000 feet. And Missouri has for decades produced the great majority of primary lead in the United States, which means that a large share of the lead in the batteries in American cars and in an enormous range of other products has come up out of the Ozarks, through shafts, in the dark, mined by people whose grandparents did the same work 100 miles east. Fact 76. Now go to the far southwestern corner, where Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma meet. This was the Tri-State Mining District. Joplin, Galena, Baxter Springs, Picker, and it produced staggering quantities of lead and zinc, especially during the 2 world wars. Zinc is what you need for brass, and brass is what you need for cartridge casings. There is a real and direct line from these hills to the ammunition of both world wars, and to get it, they honeycombed the ground beneath entire towns. Hundreds of miles of workings, thousands of shafts, spread under the streets and houses and schools. Fact 77. Then the mines closed, and the pumps stopped, and the bill came due. The waste rock left over from processing, chat they call it, was piled in enormous gray heaps beside the towns, some of them mountains, and it's laced with lead and cadmium and zinc. Children played on them. The dust blew through open windows. Blood lead levels in the area were, when finally measured properly, alarming. And underneath, the ground was failing. Ceilings of abandoned rooms collapsed. Sinkholes opened under yards and streets and in some cases under buildings. Surveys eventually concluded that large parts of Pitcher, Oklahoma were undermined and structurally unsafe, that the ground could simply go and that there was no practical way to fix it. Fact 78. So the government bought the town. Beginning around 2006, a federally funded buyout relocated the residents of Pecker and neighboring Cardine. The school closed. Businesses closed. In 2009, the town formally dissolved. Today, it is largely empty streets and foundations, and those gray chat piles standing over everything, one of the most severe environmental disaster sites in the country. An entire American town was ended because of what had been taken out from underneath it. Not a fire, not a flood, not a war. A hollow. Fact 79. Let's come back up into gentler territory, because the same technique that hollowed out Picker also produced something oddly wonderful. It's called room and pillar mining, and the logic is simple. You drive tunnels into a flat-lying seam of good rock and take out the rock in a grid, leaving behind regular columns of untouched stone to hold the ceiling up. Take too much and it comes down. Leave enough, often something like a quarter to a third of the material, and the roof stays where it is indefinitely. What you're left with when the mining is finished is not a hole. It's a room. A vast, flat-floored, level, dry, perfectly climate-stable room with columns in it, like a stone parking garage the size of a neighborhood. Fact 80. And somebody, at some point, looked at that and thought, why would we waste this? In Springfield, Missouri, there's an operation that does both at once. Limestone is mined out one end, sold as aggregate for roads and concrete, and the space that the mining creates is finished, floored, walled, and leased out as warehouse and cold storage. Millions of square feet of it, under the city, holding food and goods and records. The mine pays for itself twice. First, for the rock it removes, and then again, forever, for the emptiness it leaves behind. Fact 81. There's another at Carthage, Missouri, and the largest example of the concept in the world sits on the northwestern rim of the Ozark Plateau in Kansas City. An underground business complex developed since the 1960s in a worked-out limestone mine running to tens of millions of square feet. It has paved roads inside it, named streets, truck docks, rail spurs that run right into the rock. Thousands of people drive to work every morning and turn off the daylight into a tunnel and park underground and spend the day at a desk under 200 feet of stone. Fact 82. And the reason all this makes economic sense comes back to that number we talked about earlier. The steady 50-something degrees. An underground warehouse barely needs heating, and it barely needs cooling. It cannot be hit by a tornado. It doesn't leak in a storm, doesn't fade in sunlight, doesn't care about hail. For anything that needs to be kept cold, or kept safe, or kept for a very long time, a hole in the Ozark limestone is one of the cheapest and most reliable buildings human beings have ever devised. Some of what's stored down in these places is exactly what you'd guess. Frozen food, paper records, auto parts. Some of it is more interesting. Film archives, seed stock, government documents, and the kinds of things institutions want kept somewhere that will still be there in a century. Fact 83. Long before refrigeration, brewers had the same insight, and the eastern edge of this same limestone country made a city famous for beer. Lager needs to ferment and age cold, for weeks, At temperatures a 19th-century brewer had no way to produce artificially in a Missouri summer. But under St. Louis there were natural caves in the limestone, and brewers moved in, enlarging them, walling them, running them as cellars, packing them with ice cut from the river in winter. The reason St. Louis became one of the great brewing capitals of America is, at bottom, geological. The city was built on rock full of cold holes, at the moment in history when cold holes were the single most valuable thing a brewer could own. Fact 84. Those cellars had strange afterlives. Some became beer gardens and underground theaters and ballrooms, genuine 19th-century nightlife, held in caves, with lanterns and music and painted scenery. One system beneath the Lemp Brewery complex included, by long tradition, a swimming pool and a small theater in the rock. Most were sealed eventually, filled, walled off, or cut through by highway construction in the mid-20th century. There are rooms under that city that nobody has been inside since before the interstate went in. Fact 85. Upriver, in the German wine town of Hermann, the same instinct produced hand-built vaulted cellars, great arched brick tunnels dug into the hillsides in the 1800s for aging wine, among the largest series of vaulted wine cellars on the continent. And then Prohibition arrived, and the wine business died overnight. So what do you do with a mile of cold, dark, humid, arched tunnels, and no legal product? You grow mushrooms. For years, some of the finest wine cellars in America were a mushroom farm, which is, when you think about it, the most graceful possible surrender. The room stayed exactly the same, and simply started producing something else that liked the dark. Fact 86. Prohibition had a less respectable underground economy, too, and the Ozarks were made for it. It still needs a constant water supply, a stable temperature, concealment, and somewhere for the smoke to go. A cave provides 3 of those outright, and the hollows provide the 4th. Moonshining was widespread across these hills, a genuine cash economy in country where cash was scarce, and corn was heavy to haul, but whiskey wasn't. The stories of caves used as stills and as storage are essentially uncountable, and, unlike buried Spanish gold, they're the kind of story where the physical evidence occasionally still turns up. Rusted boiler fragments, a stone furnace ring, worm coils in the mud. Fact 87. People have also simply lived in them. In eastern Missouri, there's a well-known cave that spent much of the 20th century as a roller skating rink, and later, a concert venue. A real stage in a real cave, with bands playing to crowds in the rock, before being converted, remarkably, into a private home. A house inside a cave, with walls of stone and a facade built across the entrance. The claims about exactly which famous musicians played there are the sort of thing that grows in the telling, so I'll leave the names out. But the roller rink is documented, and the house is real, and someone has slept in that rock every night for years. Fact 88. And there's at least one cave in the Missouri Ozarks that operates as a restaurant, with tables set in the mouth of a bluff cave above a spring, the sort of place people drive an hour to eat at, in a room that was excavated by water 500,000 years before anyone thought about dinner. Fact 89. Now, the Cold War, because you cannot talk about American tunnels in the 20th century without it. In the early 1960s, the federal government ran a national shelter survey, a systematic effort to identify existing structures that could serve as fallout shelters, mark them, and stock them with supplies. Water drums, sanitation kits, dense survival crackers and carbohydrate biscuits in tins. That black and yellow trefoil sign you still occasionally see on an old building, and in a region full of large, stable, naturally shielded underground spaces, quite a lot of Ozark caves and mines got looked at very seriously indeed. Several show caves were designated. Some were stocked. Fact 90. So there was a period, roughly the Kennedy years, when the local cave was on a government list, and the town knew it, and everybody had a rough idea that if the sirens went, you drove out to the cave. There are people alive today in southern Missouri and northern Arkansas who remember, as children, being told that, who remember the drums of water in a passage they had walked through on a school trip. That's a peculiar thing to grow up with. A tourist attraction that is also the plan. And there are, by scattered reports, still remnants in a few places. Rusted tins in a back passage. A stack of drums going green. The debris of an emergency that never came. Sitting in a cool, dark room where nothing decays quickly. Waiting for a war that everyone eventually stopped expecting. Now, we've spent nearly the whole night on holes that water made and holes that miners made. But there's a third category I owe you before we finish, because these are tunnels in the plainest sense of the word. Somebody drew them on a plane, and somebody drilled them, and somebody died building them. The railroads had to get through the Boston Mountains, and the Boston Mountains did not want them to. That's the high southern rim of the Ozarks, in northwest Arkansas, not tall by Western standards, but brutally cut up. All steep grades and short curves and no easy line anywhere. When the railroad pushed south from Fayetteville toward Fort Smith in the early 1880s, the engineers ended up with one of the most notorious stretches of main line in the country. A long, punishing climb over the divide, with grades steep enough that trains needed helper engines to get over the top for the better part of a century. And at the crest, near the little town of Winslow, they had to bore through. The tunnel there runs on the order of 1,700 feet through the mountain, and it was completed around 1882. The work was done by hand and by black powder in an era before almost any safety regulation existed. Crews drilled by hammer and steel, packed charges, and got clear. Rockfalls, bad air, and blasting accidents were routine facts of the job, and the labor was largely immigrant and black work gangs living in temporary camps along the line. There's a long-standing local tradition that men who died during the construction were buried near the grade where they fell. And while I'd hedge on the specifics, the underlying reality is not in doubt. Heavy tunnel work in the 1880s killed people regularly, and their names very often went unrecorded. That tunnel is still in use. There's an excursion railroad in the region that runs passenger trains over the old grade, and you can ride through it. A few seconds of complete darkness, a change in the sound of the wheels, and then daylight and a view down into a hollow that hasn't changed much in 140 years. And then there's the water infrastructure, which produced some of the largest artificial voids in the region. In 1931, Bagnell Dam closed across the Osage River and created the Lake of the Ozarks, at the time one of the largest man-made lakes in the world. It flooded farms, it flooded roads, it flooded a railroad, and it flooded caves. There are cave entrances beneath that lake that were dry and walkable inside living memory and are now permanently submerged, entered only occasionally and only by divers. Then, in the early 1960s, came Taum Sauk, up in the ancient volcanic core of the Ozarks in Reynolds County, a pumped storage hydroelectric plant which is an idea I find genuinely charming in its simplicity. You build a reservoir on top of a mountain. At night, when power is cheap and demand is low, you pump water up into it. During the day, when demand spikes, you let it fall back down through turbines. To make it work, engineers drove a shaft and a tunnel straight down through Prophet Mountain, through granite and rhyolite that is well over 1 billion years old, to a powerhouse at the bottom. And in December of 2005, the upper reservoir failed. A wall gave way in the early morning, and something on the order of 1 billion gallons of water came off the top of that mountain in a matter of minutes, tore a channel down the mountainside, and swept through Johnson's Shut-ins State Park below. It took the park superintendent's house off its foundation with the family inside. Astonishingly, they all survived. The scar it left is still visible on that mountainside today. The reservoir was rebuilt. The tunnel through the mountain, cut through some of the oldest exposed rock on the continent, is still down there doing its job. Water falling through the dark, twice a day, forever. Fact 91. So who actually knows where all these caves are? The answer, largely, is a volunteer organization founded in 1956 called the Missouri Speleological Survey, and its counterparts elsewhere. Amateurs, mostly. People with day jobs. They keep the files. Locations, maps, descriptions, biological records, thousands upon thousands of entries built up over 70 years of weekends. And here's the thing that surprises people. Those files are not public. Cave locations are guarded, shared with landowners, agencies, and qualified researchers, but not published, not posted, not put on a map you can download. Because the single fastest way to destroy a cave is to tell everyone where it is. Formations get broken within a season. Bats get disturbed out of a hibernation they cannot afford to interrupt. Somebody with no experience goes in alone and doesn't come out. So the greatest catalog of the Ozark underworld is deliberately, carefully, quietly kept from you. Not out of mystery-mongering. Out of care. Fact 92. And making those maps is one of the more romantic technical activities I know of. Traditionally, you work in teams of 3 or 4. One person holds a tape at a fixed point. A station, marked with a bit of flagging or a scratch. Another stretches it to the next station and reads the distance. A third reads a compass for the bearing and a clinometer for the angle up or down. Then, at each station, you measure how far it is to the ceiling, the floor, and the walls left and right. Somebody writes all of it in a notebook with waterproof paper in pencil, because ink runs and pencil doesn't. Lying in mud, in the cold, with a lamp on their forehead. Then you go home and do the mathematics, and a shape appears on paper that no one has ever seen from the outside. The map of a cave is the only picture of it that exists as a whole. Nobody has ever seen a cave whole. It's too dark and too big, and the corners are in the way. The map is a collective act of imagination, assembled from thousands of small measurements taken by cold people in the dark. Fact 93. The longest cave in Missouri is Crevice Cave in Perry County, in the eastern part of the state, and its surveyed length runs to something over 30 miles. 30 miles, underground, in one system. And Perry County alone contains an astonishing concentration of long caves. Barome Moor, Mystery Cave, and others, a sinkhole plain so riddled that mapping projects there have consumed the careers of dedicated cavers who go back, weekend after weekend, year after year, to push another few hundred feet of passage. Some of those pushes end at a wall. Some end at a squeeze nobody can fit through, and some end at water. Fact 94. Which brings us to sumps, the places where the ceiling comes down and meets the water, and the passage keeps going, flooded. To go past that, you have to dive. And cave diving is, by a wide margin, one of the most demanding and least forgiving activities human beings undertake. You are underwater, in the dark, inside rock, with a hard ceiling above you, meaning you cannot ascend. If something goes wrong, the surface is not up. The surface is back the way you came, however far that is, and possibly through silt you have kicked up that reduced visibility to nothing in 3 seconds. The rules exist because people died writing them. A continuous guideline back to open water. Thirds of your gas supply reserved for the exit. Redundant lights, redundant everything, and the discipline to turn around at a planned point even when you can see something wonderful ahead. Fact 95. And the Ozarks have serious water to dive. Blue Spring, on the Current River in Shannon County, is one of the deepest springs in the country. Its explored depth runs past 300 feet, and it holds an astonishing deep blue color that comes from the sheer depth and clarity of the water. The Osage, by tradition, are said to have called it something like the spring of the summer sky. Cave divers have pushed springs and sumps all over this region, and what they keep proving is that the caves we walk in are the small, dry, accidental fragments. The main system, the real system, is full of water and always has been. Fact 96. Now, a sadder fact, and then we'll turn towards the end. A stalactite that took 4,000 years to form can be broken off in half a second by a bored teenager with a hammer, and for the rest of the history of the Earth, it will not be replaced on any timescale that means anything to us. Souvenir collecting, graffiti, spray paint, smoke writing on ceilings, formations snapped off and sold in rock shops. It happened on an industrial scale for a century. Missouri passed a cave resources law in 1980 to make that a crime. Vandalism of speleothems, disturbing cave life, dumping in sinkholes. Enforcement in thousands of remote holes on private land is obviously difficult. But the law said something true and worth saying, that these things belong to time, not to whoever happens to be standing next to them with a rock hammer. Fact 97. The gates, though, are a real success story, and they're a lovely piece of engineering. You cannot just wall up a cave to keep people out, because bats have to fly through, and air has to move, and water has to run. So bat gates are built as horizontal bars of angle iron with carefully specified gaps. Wide enough for a bat in flight, narrow enough for a person to be stopped, and they're designed to disturb airflow as little as possible, because change the temperature of a hibernation room by a couple of degrees and you can kill everything in it. Bad gates have done real damage. Good gates have saved entire colonies. The difference is a matter of inches, worked out over decades by people who cared enough to measure. Fact 98. And now, briefly, the rumors. Because the title of tonight's episode promised mysterious tunnels, and I owe you an honest accounting. Are there secret government tunnels under the Ozarks? Here's what's actually documented. There were, for decades, real hardened military holes in Missouri, underground launch facilities for Minuteman missiles, spread across the countryside west and northwest of the Ozark Uplift, operated out of Whiteman Air Force Base. Silos, control capsules buried deep, connected to their crews by hardened cable. Under arms reduction treaties, they were deactivated in the 1990s, and the silos were destroyed, some blown in place. the remains left visible from the air so that satellites could verify it. So the reality is, yes, the government did put crews and warheads in holes in Missouri, and no, they were not the mysterious ones. They were photographed, treaty verified, and demolished on a schedule. The rest, the bunkers under the lake, the tunnel from the courthouse to the old hotel, the passage that supposedly runs for miles under a small town, is mostly the same handful of ordinary things misremembered. Old brewery cellars, coal chutes, storm drains, steam tunnels between school buildings, abandoned mine adits, and the plain fact that in karst country, the ground genuinely is hollow. The truth is stranger than the rumor. Nobody needs to invent a secret tunnel network under the Ozarks. There are 7,500 of them, and nobody built any. Fact 99. Every year, new caves are found. The regional surveys add dozens of entries annually, and they turn up in the least dramatic ways imaginable. A farmer notices his pond won't hold water. A highway cut opens a void. A heavy rain washes out a hillside and leaves a hole the size of a fist that turns out to breathe cold air. That breath is the giveaway, by the way. Cavers look for it. On a cold morning, a cave exhales warm air and you'll see it fog. On a hot afternoon, it draws cool air out and the weeds bend toward the crack. A hole that breathes is a hole that goes somewhere. Fact 100. And here's the last one. I want you to picture the whole region at once, right now, tonight, while you're lying here. Under the hills of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas there are, at a conservative count, somewhere around 10,000 known caves and countless miles of mine workings. And how many human beings do you suppose are inside all of it at this moment? A night shift in a lead mine down the Viburnum Trend. A handful of workers moving pallets in an underground warehouse outside Springfield or Kansas City. Maybe. One survey team in Perry County pushing a passage on a weekend trip. 4 people in mud arguing gently about a compass reading. And that's essentially it. Every other room is empty. Thousands of chambers, tens of thousands of passages, lakes and waterfalls, and rooms with 100-foot ceilings and formations still growing a millimeter a century. And there is nobody in any of them. No light, no sound, but water. That's the real fact about the tunnels beneath the Ozarks, not that they're hidden. That they're simply there, enormous, patient, occupied by nothing but bats and blind fish and dripping water, and almost nobody on any given night is thinking about them at all. Except, tonight, you. So let's come back up now, slowly, the way you'd come up out of a cave in real life, not in a hurry, letting your eyes adjust, feeling the air change on your face as you get near the entrance. Think about what we walked through tonight. A shallow tropical sea 450 million years ago, laying down the bodies of small animals as limestone mud. A slow bulge in the crust lifting it all up into the daylight. And then rain. Nothing but rain, faintly acidic, falling and falling and falling, for a span of time so long that a fraction of a millimeter a year was enough to hollow out a country. And then the visitors. A short-faced bear reaching up a wall in the dark and leaving marks that outlasted its entire species. People under a bluff 4,000 years ago, saving the fattest seeds of a plant nobody would remember, in a shelter dry enough to keep their sandals for us to find. 12 women in 1867 with lanterns, writing their names on a wall. 2 tour guides shouting at each other through a fence in the middle of a mountain. Sisters running a cave for 50 years. a man arranging his life around a snail the size of a pinhead, divers hanging weightless in a flooded lead mine, looking at a mule barn. All of that happened in the same darkness. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not different places. The same kind of place. The same cool 56 degrees. The same patient water, hosting one story after another and remembering none of them. And it's all still going on. That's the part I'd like to leave you with as you drift off. Everything we talked about tonight is happening right now, in the present tense, a few 100 miles from most of the people listening to this. There is a drop of water forming on the tip of a stalactite, in a room nobody has ever entered. It will hang there, growing heavier, for a few minutes. Then it will fall, and it will leave behind a ring of calcite, thinner than a human hair, and another drop will begin. There's a blind fish moving through a stream under a pasture, feeling the water with its skin. There is a colony of bats hanging in a hibernation chamber, breathing perhaps once a minute. Their hearts slowed almost to stopping, waiting out a winter that is still months away from them in either direction. And there is a great deal of very old water moving through very old rock. On its way to a spring it will reach next Tuesday. None of it needs you. None of it needs anyone. It managed perfectly well for 1,000,000 years before there were people in these hills, and it will manage after. And I find that genuinely restful. Not lonely, restful. There's an enormous, cool, dark, patient world underneath everything we do up here, and it is entirely indifferent to whether today went well. You don't need to hold on to any of this. Not the names, not the dates, not the 100 facts. If you remember one thing tomorrow, it'll probably be the bear reaching up the wall, or the 12 women with their lanterns, and that's plenty. That's more than enough. So let it all drift. Let the caves go dark again in your mind, one room at a time. Let the tours end, and the lights go off, and the lampenflora stop growing, and the water keep dripping in a place with no one in it. Now, we've been talking all this time about people going underground, but somebody had to be the first to write any of it down. And it's worth knowing who that was, because he was by almost every measure badly unqualified for the job. His name was Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. In November of 1818, he was about 25 years old, a New Yorker with a background in glassmaking and an appetite for minerals, and he set out from the lead country around Potosi, Missouri, with a single companion named Levi Pettibone, intending to walk across the Ozarks to the White River and back. Neither of them really knew what they were doing. They took too little food. They were poor hunters. There are passages in Schoolcraft's own journal where he admits, with a sort of exasperated honesty, that they were reduced to something close to starvation because they could not reliably shoot anything. They got lost. They were cold. They spent that entire winter walking through hollows and up creek beds, over ridges of oak and hickory, through a landscape with almost no roads and almost no people. But he wrote it all down. Every day. The rocks, the water, the game, the plants, and the handful of families they came across. Backwoods hunters living far out on the White River, who Schoolcraft found simultaneously fascinating and appalling, and whom he described in prose so vivid and so condescending that historians have been arguing with it ever since. And along the way, in early 1819, he described a cave. By long tradition, and by the cave's own account of itself, that description of a large cave mouth on a creek in what's now Christian County, Missouri, is the earliest written record of a Missouri cave by a person who had actually stood in front of it. He noted the size of the opening, the stream running out of it, the arch of the roof. He was doing what he did all winter, seeing a thing and putting it on paper because nobody else had. That journal was published in 1821, and it became the founding document of Ozark exploration. Everything anybody in the outside world knew about that country for the next generation ran through the notebook of a cold, hungry young man who could not shoot a deer. And here's the coda I love. Schoolcraft went on to become one of the more consequential figures of 19th century America. He became an Indian agent up at Sault Ste. Marie. He married Jane Johnston, who was of Ojibwe and Scots-Irish descent and a considerable writer herself, and through her family, he collected the Ojibwe stories that Longfellow later mined for the Song of Hiawatha. In 1832, he traveled to a small lake in Minnesota and identified it as the source of the Mississippi River, and gave it the name Itasca, which he constructed out of 2 Latin words. So the man who first wrote about a hole in an Ozark hillside is also the man who named the headwaters of the continent's greatest river. He had a habit of showing up at beginnings. Now, let's stay with the written word a moment longer, because there's a second man who wrote the Ozarks down, and he was interested in exactly the opposite thing. Vance Randolph was born in 1892 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and he spent the better part of 50 years walking around the Ozarks collecting what people believed. Not what they did, what they believed. Songs, cures, charms, sayings, jokes, ghost stories, weather signs, and above all, superstitions. He published a book in 1947 that's usually known now as Ozark Magic and Folklore, and it is one of the strangest and most valuable documents in American folklore. He was not a romantic about it. He lived among the people he wrote about, in Eureka Springs and around Fayetteville, for decades. He wrote down what they told him without cleaning it up, including a whole body of bawdy material so unprintable in its own era that it sat in manuscript for something like 40 years before anyone would publish it. And a substantial slice of what he collected concerns treasure. Money hunting, they called it, and it was a real, sustained, semi-serious practice across these hills for generations. Here's some of what Randolph recorded. That a proper money hunter used a forked rod, witch hazel usually, held out in front of him, which would dip when it passed over buried metal. That the digging had to be done at night, and had to be done in complete silence, because if a single word was spoken, the treasure would sink deeper into the ground and be lost. That some hoards were guarded deliberately by a spirit, and that the way you created such a guardian in the older and darker versions of the belief was by killing something and burying it with the money. Now, think about what that means as a lived practice. Somewhere in these hills, on moonless nights, men were digging holes in absolute silence because they believed that speaking would cost them everything. Working next to each other for hours without a word, communicating by touch and gesture, then filling the hole back in before daylight so the neighbors wouldn't see. That's the most Ozark image I know, and it explains something important about all those treasure caves we talked about. The Spanish gold, the lost silver mine. These weren't idle campfire stories. They were the folklore attached to an actual behavior that actual people spent actual nights of their lives performing. Randolph, for what it's worth, never found anyone who found anything. Let's come back to the water now, and to something almost nobody thinks about when they look at an Ozark spring. For about a century, those springs were the region's industrial power grid. Here's the thing about a spring fed by a cave system. It doesn't care about the weather. A surface stream is a wild animal. It floods in April and dries up in August, and you cannot build a business on it. But a big karst spring is fed from an underground reservoir of hundreds of square miles, and it puts out an enormous, near-constant flow all year, every year, in drought and in flood, which makes it perfect for turning a mill wheel. So all through the 1800s, wherever there was a good spring in the Ozarks, somebody built a mill on it. And a mill meant a settlement, because a mill is where the whole valley has to come. You brought your corn and your wheat. You waited your turn. You traded. You got the news. You heard who had died and who was getting married. The mill was the internet. Some of them are still standing, and they're among the most photographed buildings in Missouri. There's a tall red mill at Alley Spring in Shannon County, built in the 1890s, sitting on a spring that discharges something on the order of 80 million gallons a day out of a blue-green pool at the base of a bluff. There's Hodgson Mill on Bryant Creek, and Dot Mill on the North Fork, and Greer, and half a dozen others in various states of standing and falling. And what powered them, in most cases, wasn't the picturesque overshot water wheel of the storybooks. It was a turbine, a compact, efficient, cast-iron device sitting in a chute, spun by water pressure. The Ozarks were, in a small way, an early industrial landscape, and its power came directly out of caves. But the spring's steadiness has a second consequence, and it created something that defines Missouri recreation to this day. That water comes out of the rock at about 56 to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, not just on a good day, always. In February and in July, which happens to be very close to ideal water for trout. Trout are not native to Missouri, not one species. The rivers here were bass and sunfish and catfish country, warm and slow in summer. But in the late 1800s, when American fish culture was in its enthusiastic infancy, and people were shipping fish eggs around the country in barrels of ice, somebody looked at these springs and did the arithmetic. And so today, Missouri has trout parks: Bennett Spring, Montauk, Roaring River, Merrimack Spring, and every single one of them is built on a major karst spring. They're hatcheries with a river attached, and on opening day of catch-and-keep season in March, thousands of people stand, shoulder to shoulder, in the cold water waiting for a siren. Roaring River, down in Berry County near the Arkansas line, has a nice piece of history behind it. In 1928, the property came up at auction and was bought by a St. Louis businessman named Thomas Seaman, who had made a fortune in patent medicines and soap. He bought it, and then almost immediately handed it to the state of Missouri as a public park. So, one of the best-loved parks in the state exists because a soap magnate went to an auction and then, apparently on a whim of genuine generosity, gave the thing away. And there's one more spring industry worth a moment, because it's so quiet nobody notices it. Watercress. Watercress wants clean, cold, constantly moving water, which is exactly what a spring branch is, and Ozark springs supported commercial watercress beds for decades. Green rows of it growing in flowing water, 56 degrees in January, under a bluff. Now let's talk about a town that was built entirely on the belief that this water could heal you. In the 1870s, in the hills of northwest Arkansas, there was a spring in a hollow that local people said had medicinal properties. A physician named Alva Jackson had been promoting the water for years. There's a story that he had treated his own son's eye ailment with it. Word spread, and in 1879, the word turned into a stampede. People came by the thousands. Sick people, desperate people, people who had been told by doctors that there was nothing to be done. They arrived in wagons and on foot and camped in the hollow around the spring, and within a matter of months there was a city where there had been a wooded ravine. Eureka Springs went from essentially nothing to a population in the many thousands inside about a year. One of the fastest boom towns in American history, and it was built not on gold, not on oil, but on water coming out of a rock. And because it grew that fast on ground that steep, it grew crookedly. The streets in Eureka Springs follow the contours instead of a grid. There are buildings where you can enter on the ground floor from one street and walk out of the third floor onto another. The whole town is stacked on a hillside, like books shoved into a shelf sideways, and beneath and behind it all is the karst that made the springs in the first place, which means basements cut into rock and passages under buildings, and the persistent local conviction that the town's underlevels connect in ways nobody has fully mapped. Up on the ridge above town stands the Crescent Hotel, opened in 1886, a great limestone pile built for wealthy visitors taking the waters. And in 1937, it was bought by a man named Norman Baker. Baker was a former vaudeville magician from Iowa who had made a great deal of money selling an air-driven musical instrument, and then made a great deal more running a radio station on which he denounced the medical establishment and promoted his own cure for cancer. He had already been prosecuted in Iowa. So he moved to Arkansas, bought a hotel on a hilltop, painted it in lavender and purple, and opened it as a cancer hospital. He had no medical training whatsoever. His treatment, by the accounts of investigators, involved injections of a preparation that included such things as watermelon seed and clover, and he charged desperate people substantial sums for it, and some of them came there to die and did. He was convicted of mail fraud in 1940 and sent to Leavenworth for 4 years, and the hospital closed. The building went back to being a hotel and is one to this day. And here's the part that reads like fiction. In recent years, archaeologists excavating the old hospital's dump on the hillside behind the hotel began pulling out bottles and jars by the crate, the physical residue of the operation, buried and forgotten for 80 years, including, reportedly, specimen jars. An entire fraudulent medical empire thrown down a slope in the woods, waiting. Let's go back underground now to the mines we haven't talked about yet, because the Ozarks were dug for a great deal more than lead. Start with sand. Under the eastern Ozark border, around Pacific, Missouri, and running south toward Crystal City, there's a formation called the St. Peter Sandstone, and it is remarkable stuff. It is almost pure silica, the grains rounded and sorted and uniform, laid down in what must have been an enormous ancient desert or shoreline. If you want to make glass, that's the sand you want. So they mined it from the 1870s onward, and they mined it underground, room and pillar, exactly as we described. And the result is a set of chambers under the hills west of St. Louis that are genuinely startling. Soft, white sandstone walls, square-cut corridors, columns left standing, going on and on in the dark. The stone is so uniform and so workable that the cuts look almost architectural. Those mines fed the American glass industry for generations, and as sections worked out, people found other uses for them: storage, and reportedly mushroom growing, which follows the same logic as the wine cellars at Herman. Cool, dark, humid, stable. A worked-out mine is a farm waiting for the right crop. Then there's barite, tiff, as the locals called it, mined heavily in Washington County. Barite is heavy, and its main modern use is in drilling mud for oil wells, where you need something dense to hold pressure down a borehole. But the way it was mined in the Ozarks, for a long stretch, was not industrial at all. It was families. Hand-dug pits and shallow diggings, worked with a pick and a shovel and a screen, hauling the mineral out by the wagon load and selling it by weight. Through the Depression, tiff digging was a way for people in that county to stay fed when there was no other cash in the world. Whole communities out in the woods digging. And there's iron. Up in the ancient volcanic core, Pilot Knob and Iron Mountain, there were deposits rich enough to sustain furnaces from the 1840s onward, worked first from the surface and, in the 20th century, underground. That's also the site of one of the strangest nights of the Civil War in Missouri. In September of 1864, a Confederate force under Sterling Price attacked a small earthwork at the foot of Pilot Knob called Fort Davidson, held by a much smaller Union garrison under Thomas Ewing. The attackers came across open ground and were cut to pieces. The casualty numbers were lopsided and terrible. But Ewing knew he couldn't hold a second day. So that night, in the dark, his men muffled the wheels of their guns, walked out through a gap in the encircling lines, and disappeared. And behind them, they left a lit fuse running into the fort's powder magazine. It went up in the small hours. The Confederates woke to an explosion and an empty fort. The crater is still there. You can go and stand at the edge of it, a grassy depression in the middle of an earthen square, in the shadow of a mountain full of iron, which is the hole left by everything the Union Army couldn't carry. Now, let's come forward to the present, because living on top of a hollow landscape creates problems that no other kind of ground creates, and modern Ozark engineering is largely the story of trying to build on something that will not stay put. Here's the situation. You want to put up a school, or a shopping center, or a stretch of interstate. Before you pour anything, you have to know what's under it. In most of America, that means checking the soil. In karst, it means checking for voids, because there may be a cavity 20 feet down that has been quietly enlarging for 100,000 years and is now holding up your parking lot with about as much conviction as an eggshell. So they drill. Grids of test borings, sometimes dozens of them. Feeling for the moment the drill string suddenly drops, that free fall of a few feet that tells you the bit has just punched through a roof into empty space. They run ground-penetrating radar and resistivity surveys, looking for the signature of air where rock should be. And when they find something, the usual answer is grout. You pump concrete slurry down a hole and fill the void. Sometimes it takes what you'd expect. Sometimes it takes truckload after truckload after truckload. And everybody stands around watching a pump run all afternoon while the ground swallows concrete and nobody knows exactly where it's going, because whatever is down there is connected to something else. That's a peculiarly Ozark experience, filling a hole in the ground and having the ground refuse to fill. And when it isn't caught in time, you get the sinkholes people actually remember. In 2004, in the suburbs west of St. Louis, a subdivision lake called Lake Chesterfield, a genuine lake, more than a dozen acres, with houses around it and property values attached to it, drained, not over a season, essentially overnight. A hole opened in the bottom, and the whole thing went down into the rock, leaving a bowl of cracked mud with docks standing in it. They repaired it, at considerable expense, and by some accounts it has given trouble more than once since, because you cannot really win that argument. The water knows where it wants to go, and it has known for a very long time. And down in Christian County, in 2006, a large sinkhole opened near a home outside Nixa, a serious one, wide and deep, the kind that makes the national news and gets photographed with a person standing near the edge for scale. There's no way to make that entirely safe. What Missouri and Arkansas do instead is map. Geological surveys keep sinkhole inventories, and karst hazard mapping is a routine part of planning in the worst of the sinkhole plains. But there are hundreds of thousands of acres of Ozark ground where nobody has ever drilled a single test hole, and under some of it, quietly, roofs are getting thinner, which raises the obvious question. What happens when a person is down there and something goes wrong? Cave rescue is its own discipline, and it is one of the slowest, most laborious forms of rescue there is. In the United States, there's a body called the National Cave Rescue Commission that trains for it, and much of the actual capability sits with volunteer cavers, because the people who know the passage and can physically fit through it are usually the same people who mapped it. Here's why it's so hard. Imagine a caver 1,000 feet in, past 2 crawls and a climb, with a broken ankle. On the surface, that's a 20-minute problem. Down there, it can be a 12-hour problem or a 24-hour one. You cannot carry a stretcher through a crawlway. You pass it, which means you need people, dozens of them, stationed along the route, lying in the mud, handing a loaded litter from one pair of hands to the next, foot by foot, for hours. At a vertical pitch, you have to rig a haul system in a space with no room to stand. And every one of those rescuers had to get in there too, with gear, and will have to get back out. And the whole time, the clock that matters is not the injury. It's temperature. 56 degrees does not sound dangerous, but a person lying still on wet rock in wet clothes in 56-degree air at 100% humidity is losing heat continuously and has no way to generate more. Hypothermia is the thing that kills people underground far more often than the fall that stopped them. So the very first job of the first rescuer to reach a patient is almost never medical. It's insulation. Get them off the rock. Get something under them and something around them before anything else, which is why every caver carries more than they think they need, and why the oldest rule in the sport is the one your mother would give you. Tell somebody where you're going and when you'll be back. In a cave, nobody can see you. Nobody will happen along. There is no passing hiker. If nobody knows you went in, nobody comes. Now, let's lighten this, because caves in the Ozarks have also been, for 100 years, places where people go to be happy. At Camdenton, Missouri, there's a cave called Bridal Cave, and its name is not decorative. Weddings are held in it, thousands of them. The commonly cited figure is somewhere north of 4,000 ceremonies since the late 1940s, held in a chamber of dripping formations at a constant 50-something degrees. There's a legend attached about an Osage wedding held in the cave in the distant past, and I'd treat that the way we've treated all the other legends tonight, as a story that grew where a story was useful. But the modern practice is entirely real, and there's something rather moving about it.
People choosing, for the single most public moment of their lives, to go down into the rock, to make a promise in a room that will outlast every promise ever made in it by a factor of about 10,000. At Versailles, Missouri, there's Jacob's Cave, found in the 1870s by a lead miner, which contains the bones of Ice Age animals, mastodon, bear, peccary, worked into the sediments, and long reflective pools that double the ceiling so perfectly and that visitors lose track of which way is up. And at
Lake of the Ozarks State Park, there's a cave where the tours are still given by handheld lantern. No fixed lighting at all. You carry your own small circle of light through the passage, which is exactly how every single human being experienced a cave for the first 200,000 years of our history, and it changes the whole feeling of the place. The room does not exist all at once. It exists only where you point. Deep in that cave, there's a feature called the angel showers, where water falls from the ceiling in a fine rain out of a source no one can see. No visible opening, no visible crack, just water arriving from somewhere in the rock above. And then there are the caves that are simply gone. When the big dams went in on the White River, Bull Shoals in 1951, Table Rock in 1958, they didn't just flood farms and towns and bottomland, they flooded the bluffs. And those bluffs were full of caves at every level, all the way down to the old river. Every one of those entrances below the new waterline is now permanently submerged. Some of them were known caves that people had walked in. Others had never been entered by anyone, and the water simply came up and closed them, and they are still down there, full of lake water in the dark under the boats. Divers occasionally visit a handful of them, but most are unlogged and unvisited, and the passages behind those drowned entrances go back into the hills as far as they ever did, holding whatever they held. The same thing happened, on a smaller scale, all over the region. Bagnell in 1931, Norfolk in 1944, Beaver in the 60s. Every reservoir in the Ozarks has a shoreline of drowned cave mouths. And that, I think, is the last thing worth holding on to tonight. The sheer amount of this country that is not accessible and never will be. We've talked about 7,500 known caves. We've talked about 30 miles of passage in a single Perry County system, and 80 miles of tunnel under one Missouri lead town, and a spring pouring out 250 million gallons a day from a plumbing system nobody has entered. But every one of those figures is a floor, not a ceiling. Every one of them is what we happen to have found. Behind the sumps, past the squeezes too small for a human ribcage, under the lakes, beneath the pastures where nobody has ever drilled, there is a great deal more of it. Rooms with no entrance, streams with no name, formations growing in the exact center of a hill where no light has ever fallen and no light ever will. That's not a mystery anybody is going to solve. It's just the permanent condition of living on karst. You go about your business on the surface, and the ground beneath you is doing something enormously slow and enormously old, and you will never see most of it. The water is moving down there right now, the way it was moving before Schoolcraft walked through with an empty stomach and a notebook, the way it was moving before the bluff dwellers spread their sandals to dry, the way it was moving before the short-faced bear stood up and put its claws in a wall, cool, dark, steady, 56 degrees. Still going. There's nothing down there tonight that needs anything from you. Sleep well,